Okay, so this is the hard palate, and then at the back is the soft palate, the tongue, lingual frenulum. Ooh, cut, cool. The lingual frenulum was this tissue that was holding the tongue tight to the bottom of the mouth like that. The epiglottis is this flap that looks like an upside down spoon. And the nasopharynx is the space up above, which is below because the pig is upside down, at the back of the snout. So if it's behind the epiglottis, it has to be nasopharynx. And then this expanded structure above the trachea is the larynx. And then you can see, hopefully in the video, you can see the rings of the trachea. So this is the trachea. Here's the thyroid gland right on top of the trachea in the center. And the thymus gland is on either side of the thyroid, kind of flanking the structures of the throat. And the esophagus, sorry, wrong E word. The esophagus is right there behind the trachea, right there. Harder to see. So the esophagus is right under the trachea, thyroid on top of that. Thymus flanks that, and then there's more thymus superficial to the pericardial sac on the superior edge of the heart. Pericardial sac is this structure that was cut, and the visceral pericardium or epicardium is right on the heart. This is the lungs on either side. The layer on the surface of the lungs would be the visceral pleura. The layer up against the chest cavity wall is the parietal pleura. Then you have the diaphragm that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. The inside of the abdominal wall is the parietal peritoneum. Here's the liver. On the underneath surface of the liver, the inferior surface, is the gallbladder. And the cystic duct is the only one of the ducts that I would ask you about, which is this one coming off of the gallbladder. So you can cross off common hepatic and common bile duct. The lesser omentum is the mesentery that runs between the underneath side of the liver and the lesser curvature of the stomach. Okay. This is the stomach. Here's the pyloric sphincter, this expanded structure before it goes to a narrow tube. The narrow tube is the duodenum. The cardiac sphincter, is going to be right next to the lesser omentum. So here's the lesser omentum, and then here's where the stomach is connecting to the esophagus, running behind the liver and going up through the diaphragm. So the cardiac sphincter is right there. This is the spleen, which looks like a tongue in the pig rather than a fist, what it looks like in humans. So spleen. Below and behind the stomach and retroperitoneal, meaning I'm breaking the parietal peritoneum to expose it a little bit more, is the pancreas, kind of grainy looking structure here. The duodenum goes to small intestine in general. All of this tube is small intestine. And anywhere along here, this is one of my favorite things. If you pull this out, you can see the mesentery proper. So a mesentery, the lesser omentum and the mesentery proper are both mesenteries. So you have visceral peritoneum connected to the abdominal wall in the back. It comes away from the abdominal wall, wraps around the tube of the small intestine, and goes back to the abdominal wall on the other side. So on the small intestine, there's one layer, that's the visceral peritoneum on the organ. But over here, where it's clear in the pig, and with the lines going through it, is the mesentery, which means that there's visceral peritoneum up against visceral peritoneum on the other side. So 2 layers of visceral peritoneum with no organ in between. It suspends all the abdominal organs from the wall. So even though there's so much stuff, yes, I'm sure there is. All those lines are blood vessels and nerves. So there's probably some loose connective tissue in between them. But the layers on the outside are visceral peritoneum. So the mesentery of the small intestine is the mesentery proper, and the mesentery that runs between the underneath surface of the liver and the lesser curvature of the stomach is the same thing, visceral peritoneum coming off the liver, going down, wrapping around the stomach, and going back up the other side. That's the lesser omentum. So I'm actually going to talk about those a little more on Thursday. I haven't talked about them yet. Then you can follow the small intestine around to find the end of it. And this little structure that looks like a crooked, wrinkly finger is a dead end. That's the cecum. Their cecum is enormous in proportion to the rest of their colon, compared with ours is much smaller. So the cecum, here's where the small intestine is connecting to the top part of the cecum. So the ileocecal valve would be right in there, and this is the ileum of the small intestine. And then the cecum hangs down below as a dead end, looking like a finger, and then the colon of the pig is the spiral. They don't have ascending, transverse, descending, all that stuff, so just colon. And then the very last part of the large intestine is the rectum, which is not exactly straight up and down here, but right here at the back. And these are the kidneys, which you don't need to know, but they're on either side of the rectum.
And where was the duodenum again?
The duodenum is the first part of the small intestine. So stomach is this deflated basketball. Pyloric sphincter is the hardened, enlarged structure coming off of it, and then where it gets narrow is the duodenum.
Okay. And then that's it?
Yeah, you guys can check and make sure I didn't miss anything, but I tried to be very thorough for Kelly.
Oh, what was the greater curvature and lesser curvature again?
So the greater curvature is the lateral edge.
And then lesser is the medial?
Lesser is the medial curve.
Okay.
So it's this whole part would be the greater curvature. And there is a greater omentum. See this little, you don't need to know this, but this little tiny flap is the greater omentum of the pig, which is why we don't ask you about it. But the greater omentum in humans, we deposit adipose tissue into all of our mesenteries, and the greater omentum is this like huge apron thing. Omentum means apron. This huge apron thing that hangs down over all the abdominal organs. So we'll learn it in the cadaver, it's huge. In the pig, it's tiny.
And then I just had a question. From the bottom of, I think it was the liver, going, I don't know, maybe it was underneath the inferior vena cava. Yeah, that's is the entrance into the, what's that hole? And then the other guy's like right there. Right there. Yeah.
Yeah, that looks like inferior vena cava.
Okay.
Yep. Because it seems to be going right up into the bottom of the right atrium, which is where that goes.
Okay. Cool. Alrighty.